Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War update extra video, and the extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. We're going to deal with only one subject today, and I'll try and do it as concisely as possible. It's not hugely well, I guess, prepared. This is stream of consciousness with a bunch of stimuli, right? Well prepared video, but I am responding to Bertold, who's a great member of the threads here, casts his opinion very often, so thank you so much for that. Has a go at me in terms of, or in the context of draft evasion. So I've talked about how, in several videos, how there are nations in Europe that diverge on what to do with draft evaders. And I think this in itself shows that actually it's not so clear cut. There are some nations who say, right, if we are in support of Ukraine and we will support Ukraine in repatriating draft evaders if we find them in our country, or we're planning to do so, or this is something that we would entertain. There are other nations that say we would not entertain that and they would be able to live here. Whether they would be accorded refugee status, it isn't so clear actually. And I think there's two things going on there. There's one, we won't send them back, but there's two, we won't send them back even though they do or don't have refugee status. So, you know, it's irrespective of refugee status. But we're going to be arguing a lot about whether you qualify as being a refugee based on saying you don't want to fight in a war when you are conscripted or mobilized to do so. And there are other nations like Poland who have said, we're going to wait till the EU makes a ruling on this and then follow accordingly. Now, Bertold said to me, the idea of sending conscientious objectors back to Ukraine and denying them the right to asylum is not a moral minefield. Now, I think possibly the whole root of the disagreement between Bertold and myself is the fact that he thinks I'm talking about conscientious objectors the whole time. So conscientious objectors are people who oppose bearing arms or who object to any type of military training and service. Some conscientious objectors refuse to submit to any of the procedures of compulsory conscription. Here's the important part. Although all objectors take their position on the basis of conscience, they may have varying religious, philosophical or political reasons for their beliefs. What is generally being talked about, as far as I can work out, with those draft evaders who are in Europe, is that they aren't actually conscientious objectors. These are people that are not objecting to any military service on the basis of their religion, on the basis of the morality of this all, or on the basis of some like overarching political reason. I think what I've been talking about anyway are people who are evading draft out of a sense of self-preservation. So imagine I'm a Ukrainian, right? I am leaving. I know that there's going to be a big mobilization drive, and I know that there's going to be a high probability or a significant probability, higher than I would like, of being killed or injured in this war. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to leave and get a job in the EU, take my family with me or whatever. And I'm going to go to the EU so that I'm not mobilized. But I agree with what Ukraine is doing defending Ukraine. I am very pro-Ukrainian. So we know of many Ukrainians around. I've met some around Europe who are very much in support of Ukraine, but it doesn't reach a threshold of them wanting to commit themselves to fighting for Ukraine. And so then I use an example of Finnish conscription where, you know, can you seek refugee status because you're against being conscripted? So could someone from Finland who's going to have national conscription but they're not at war go to another country and say, look, I don't want to be conscripted? Now, you could think about conscientious objection there, and that'd be slightly different than like I think that differentiates you from many of these other Ukrainians, and there will be some proper Ukrainian conscientious objectors, but I think it would be very difficult to get refugee status on the fact of like, I just want to evade draft, I just don't want to do military service. So then does it come to, well, what's the difference there? Well, the difference between military service in Finland and Ukraine is the degree of risk, but then it's just a spectrum, right? All jobs have a degree of risk. So if I'm a pilot and I'm flying, I'm like, well, statistically there's a 1 in whatever chance of me dying in doing my job. Is that enough to say I really don't think I should be asked to do this job? I know it's kind of the idea that you sign up to do that job, but do you get the point where, at what point does the risk you're facing in your job mean that you can go and seek refugee status or refuse to do it or whatever? So if that's a principle of removing yourself from Ukraine because it's self-preservation, what is an acceptable risk, and how do you work that out? And what if you are put into a mechanics group in far behind the front lines, just fixing tanks, back near Lviv or something? What if you are doing HR? What if you're looking at satellite imagery back in an office in Kiev? Okay, what if you're fighting on front lines? So there are many different risk probabilities here that risk evaluations that I think make it very difficult, and it becomes very subjective, and there are lots of unknowns. But are any of those points on that spectrum justification for draft evasion? And that's kind of the question. So when Berthold here is talking about conscientious objectors as being what he's talking about, we could be disagreeing with each other because we're just talking about different types of people. I'm not talking about that. But then he goes on to talk about someone who's not a conscientious objector. So I don't know whether his definition of conscientious objector is somewhat different. Anyway, I said it is a moral minefield, and he said, no, it's not a moral minefield. The idea of sending conscientious objectors back to Ukraine and denying them the right to asylum is not a moral minefield. It is perfectly straightforward. I don't think it is perfectly straightforward because countries disagree, and there are lots of legal wranglings over this. And I think that makes it fairly, clear that it's not clear. You only need to read the Geneva Convention on Refugees and all will be clear. Claiming asylum or refugee status, there is a difference that we can ignore here, is a so-called subjective right that signatory states have to examine from case to case. That's important, case to case, and that is true. That means if assuming that I were a male Ukrainian and Ukraine would like to conscript, claim refugee status in a signatory country, every European country, then my subjective fear concerning any eventual danger to my personal health, for example, Russians shooting at me were I conscripted, not only must be taken into consideration, but it is beneficial to my claim and its chance of success. So it's interesting that he's now using an example of risk, probability of harm against conscientious objection. So it's not a religious, political, or moral rejection of conscription, but it's a probability of harm. So I think there's maybe some confusion of ideas here, and that's really super important, as you'll see soon. So most male refugees from the Middle East who have fled to Europe are here because of this right, and they have of this right that they have under international law. That explains why there are so many young male refugees here. They often say, if I'd stayed in my country, I would have to kill or be killed. Sorry, JP, I know that you would like to send them back. I don't know where he's got that from, but that ain't going to happen. I mean, that's absolutely, and I've got a lot of time for this guy. We have lots of conversations, but actually I find that quite problematic because I've never said anything like that. In fact, my position on sending back draft evaders is completely split down the middle. I don't know what I believe. If I was in charge of a country that had to make this decision, what we should do about Ukrainian refugees, I'd have to have a big symposium where we all talk about it. I see all the legal ramifications and we have a big philosophical discussion. Because at the moment, right now, at this point in time, and for the last 2 years, I have not cast my opinion either way on this. And if I have, that's been a slip of the tongue or something, but I'm pretty sure I haven't, because I don't know what I feel about this. So I wouldn't send people back. That's just not cool. That is part of our humanistic heritage, and that you or the AFD can't change overnight. But I wouldn't mind if Denis Davidov, who fled to Switzerland to avoid conscription, although he's a pilot and can aim an F-16 at Putin, was sent back. He said some things that border on racist. So it's interesting. So he's talking about someone who I think we can agree probably isn't a conscientious objector. Don't know what's going on there. I then defended this. He then said something, and then we're going to go on to this comment because it's really pertinent to where we're going to go next. So this is not he said, she said argument. This is a stimulus to give you a broad understanding of what this conversation is and what the argument is now and is going to be. So he says what some countries will or won't do is irrelevant to this discussion because they can or cannot do so dictated by the Geneva Convention on Refugees that they, the signatories, were all obliged to incorporate into their respective national legislation. If a country doesn't adhere to the principles set out here, like the UK, for example, at present, then they are in contravention of the convention and subject to international scrutiny and sanctions. I'm going to refer back to the UK actually, but they are broadly taking on the UNHCR. So they are referring to all the same documentation. Subjective rights are indeed clear-cut. Not too sure about that. I beg to disagree. If a Ukrainian male refugee says that he is afraid of being shot at, etc., by Russians were he in Ukraine, he will be automatically recognized as a refugee. This is, as far as I can tell, empirically not true. Or at least it's not. Yeah, I just, on that basis alone, that is not grounds for refugee status. So I would actually argue that Berthold is simply wrong here. And we'll look at exactly why in a second. That is what a refugee is. I don't think they would qualify under law for refugee status if that was their only argument. Whether one likes it or not, those rights exist for us too. In Eritrea, Somalia, and Mozambique, Uganda, Burundi, etc., 14-year-old boys were forced to join the army and massacre civilians. If there were no international agreement that would stop them being sent back, if they fled, then the world would be a different place. Yes, but you are now conflating two completely different ideas. Someone who wants to avoid draft in Ukraine, that is a legal mobilization, so someone's over 18, probably over 25, was 27, and feels that there's a high probability of them dying, but they're not going to be executed themselves or not for evading draft. It's a normal legal processes, but they just fancy just getting out that whole situation and going to Europe, as many people have done, is different from a 14-year-old boy being effectively kidnapped into doing war crimes on other people. Is just a completely different example. And again, we're going to look into this. But most of this is irrelevant in relation to Ukraine because the backlog of asylum and refugee claims in Europe is so great that the authorities do not have the capacity to process all these cases. The process of claiming refugee status can last months, even years. If you're turned down, which hardly ever happens, you can appeal and hire a good lawyer specialised in asylum law. Because of this backlog and bureaucracy, the EU has passed a bill that makes Ukrainian refugees exempt from this procedure. For all intents and purposes, they are treated as any other EU national. They can settle in any EU country of their choosing and claim welfare benefits, etc. Anyway, and then he talks about the Finnish situation, because that's the example I gave of being like difficult. Anyway, we're going to go from here to look at some of the documentation. So we're going to start with the UNHCR, which is the United Nations Refugee Agency. And it says, in view of the fact that a number of persons have recently made, this is their position on certain types of draft evasion, in view of the fact that a number of persons have recently made public their refusal to be drafted into the National Army and may, particularly in light of latest developments, seek asylum in neighbouring states, it is necessary to recall UNHCR's position on draft evasion in the context of refugee status determination under the 1951 Convention relating to the state of refugees. And they refer to the Handbook of Procedures and Criteria for Determination of Refugee Status, paragraphs 167 to 174. We'll refer to that a bit later, as well as previous like amicus curiae brief by the office in late 1988 to the United States Court of Appeals for Ninth Circuit, using some legal precedents. Okay, so the position can be summarized as followed. And we're going to concentrate a little bit on this part A first. So, fear of prosecution or punishment for draft evasion does not in itself constitute well-founded fear of persecution under the definition. In other words, if you fear being punished by, so let's use Ukraine as an example. I'm a Ukrainian. I fear being punished for evading draft. And if that punishment was a normal kind of, right, you might have, I don't know, 6 months in prison, but it's perfectly humane prison. You just go through the legal procedure or whatever, or you get fined this much or whatever it is. The fear of that, it does not qualify as persecution. In other words, I would not be entitled to be a refugee just for that. Conversely, so on the other hand, draft evasion does not exclude a person from being a refugee. He or she may be a draft evader and a refugee. Well, yeah. Okay. So actually, no, we'll go on to this next part and then possibly come back to that by looking at the UK publication in a second. Anyway, part B. There are cases where the necessity to perform military service may be the sole ground for the claim to refugee status, i.e. when a person can show that the performance of military service would have required his participation in military action contrary to his genuine political, religious or moral convictions or to valid reasons of conscience. In other words, there are cases where being drafted, so you could be a Ukrainian, you could be, say, a pro-Russian Ukrainian, or you could be a total pacifist Ukrainian, and you've got to show that you haven't just decided you become a pacifist. But you know, there are cases where you can be a conscientious objector and claim refugee status. The thing is, and that's what I was saying about this conversation and earlier with Bertold, is that he has conflated conscientious objector with anyone that's just trying to evade draft, and I don't. These are two separate categories. One category you can, but again, you have to argue for it. You don't just like, I'm a conscientious objector. Okay, you're a refugee. Thanks, mate. You have to prove that you have genuine objections that fall in line with political, religious, or moral convictions, valid reasons of conscience. And it goes on to say in part C, not every conviction, genuine though it may be, will constitute a sufficient reason. So, you know, you may have, and they may be genuine, reasons for conscientiously objecting, but they still may not constitute a sufficient reason. In other words, you have to argue this. You're not automatically granted refugee status, which appears to be what Bertold is saying. It's like he said, it is very clear. It's very straightforward. Claiming asylum or refugee status is a so-called subjective right. Yeah, it may be a right, but you don't get it just because it's a right. You have to argue for it, and you have to show that you qualify effectively for conscientious objection. But again, that's not all that, you know, I'm actually not talking about conscientious objectors is another thing. I'm talking about people that are just, hey, I don't want to join the army. I think there's a probability of me dying, so I'm going to go to Poland to get a job. But if we are going to go to conscientious objectors, it's still not enough. You have to argue. You have to sufficiently argue for that. Where, however, the type of military action with which an individual does not wish to be associated is condemned by the international community as contrary to basic rules of human conduct, punishment or for draft evasion could, in the light of other requirements of the definition, in itself be regarded as persecution. This is where it gets interesting. So I think it is more clear-cut to be able to argue to be a refugee, claim refugee status if you are a Russian evading war, evading mobilization, than a Ukrainian. I think a country has more legal basis, based on the UNHCR, Geneva Convention, whatever, based on conscientious objection and persecution. Now, there are two things with Russia. One, what will happen if you evade draft? So if you are sent to a gulag, if you are treated in a prison, if you are persecuted overly harshly, disproportionately harshly, but also if you are sent to war and you are committing war crimes and you have barrier troops who are shooting you if you retreat, or you're executed for drinking or whatever, all of these things together, and also the fact that the international community has condemned the war as being contrary to the basic rules of human conduct, I think that will apply to Russians and not so much to Ukrainians. D. A person whose refusal to perform military service is based on genuine religious, moral, or political convictions can also be considered a refugee, provided that the genuineness of such convictions and the likelihood of prosecution and sanction or other treatment amounting to persecution are established. In other words, as I said earlier, you don't just automatically qualify. You have to give a reasonably credible case for you being a conscientious objector. And if you think you're going to be persecuted disproportionately when you return to your country, or if you were to be in your country and you were evading draft and were caught, then you can qualify for refugee status. But that's not automatic, right? And then lastly, E here, assuming that the religious, moral, and political conviction advances reasonably credible and surrounding circumstances of the case do not argue otherwise, a draft evader of that description may be accorded refugee status, even though the punishment he faces does not differ substantially from that meted out generally for this offence because of simple disinclination to serve. So the translation of that is, if I just wanted to avoid draft in Ukraine, and the punishment for that was only, I don't know, 6 months in prison or a fine or whatever, nothing disproportionate, then you can still, even though the punishment isn't like crazy disproportionate, you can still claim refugee status by establishing the normal conscientious objection criteria. It doesn't matter how serious the evasion prosecution is, not persecution, prosecution. Your punishment for evading draft need not be crazy serious to be able to claim refugee status. That's how I understand that. Right, we're going to go and look at the UK regulations here because it pertains precisely to Ukraine. And it is also in line with the UNHCR. So the country policy and information note, military service, Ukraine, June 2022. So it's trying to set out like how to assess and how to rule on refugee status for people who are evading draft. And it says, so, the convention reasons, so it talks about religion, political opinion, individual circumstances, which I think is all very interesting, all kind of what we're talking about. You still have to establish that. And then we go on to risk. And risk is an interesting one here. So that's kind of what I've been talking about, right? So 2.41, compulsory national service is a prerogative of sovereign states. It is therefore reasonable that draft evasion and desertion are criminal offences and punishable by law. In other words, if you are going to be punished for evading draft, that is not persecution. That we agree with that, says the UK. It's not a problem, this. It is not good enough to get refugee status just on point of fact that you are going to be punished, as long as it's not disproportionate. And it refers to the UNHCR Handbook and Guidelines on Procedures and Criteria for Determining Refugee Status, paragraphs 167 to 174. So that's what was referenced earlier in the UNHCR. It says the UNHCR Handbook further notes, quote, desertion or draft evasion does not, on the other hand, exclude a person from being a refugee, and a person may be a refugee in addition to being a deserter or draft evader. So you can be a draft evader and get refugee status, but being a draft evader doesn't automatically entitle you to refugee status. That's kind of the point, the argument between Bertold and myself. So it says in 2.4.2, therefore, a requirement to undergo compulsory military service or punishment for failing to complete this duty does not in itself constitute persecution. It will only do so. So you are only justified in claiming refugee status on the basis of persecution if military service would involve acts with which a person may be associated which are contrary to the basic rules of human conduct. We kind of talked about that. So that is, I would argue, if you're in the Russian army mobilized and you were made to go and commit atrocities, torture people, kill them, shoot POWs, do things that, as it says here, are contrary to the basic rules of human conduct, that would be persecution. Now, I'd argue the Ukrainians don't do that, right? And so therefore, as a Ukrainian draft evader, prima facie, that you would not qualify. B, the conditions of military service would be so harsh as to amount to persecution. And again, I don't think that is generally easy to argue for the Ukrainian point of view, but would be far easier from the Russian point of view, with barrier troops being executed, the threat of execution, being tortured yourselves by being put in those pits and all the kind of things that the Russians do, I would say would qualify you to arguing for that you are being persecuted, right? Or C, the punishment for draft evasion punishment for draft evasion or desertion is disproportionately harsh or severe. In other words, if you evade draft, there's persecution because you are going to get executed or tortured or sent to a gulag for 57 years, right? None of which is the case in Ukraine. And so therefore, the kind of risk situation, I don't think yet applies. I don't think you automatically would apply as a would qualify, as a refugee from what we've seen so far. And then the UK piece goes on to say 2.44, those who are eligible for or who are otherwise exempt from national service are unlikely to have a well-founded fear of persecution or show a real risk of serious harm, based on 2.4.2. So that's pretty interesting. It says on January 1st, 2022, the National Resistance Act provided for the recruitment of 120,000 civilian reservists who would form a territorial defence force in addition to 10,000 people already in place. In the event of mobilisation, they must report to their units within 24 hours. Members of the territorial defence force would normally be required to provide support behind the front line, but may be sent to the front line if it is deemed necessary. 2.4.6 says on the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. On the same day, martial law was introduced for a period of 30 days and subsequently extended 3 times. The last extension was in May. Martial law was extended by 90 days to August 23rd. Also on 24th of February 2022, Zelensky signed a decree of general mobilization in all regions of Ukraine plus the city of Kyiv. It became law, etc., etc. Males aged 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave Ukraine as long as martial law is in place. It goes on to say Ukrainian news outlet Ukrinform reported that a draft law would make it a legal requirement for men outside Ukraine who are subject to conscript during mobilization to return to Ukraine within 15 days of the introduction of martial law. In peacetime, males aged 18 to 27 are eligible for conscription unless they fall into one of the categories for exemption. The maximum age for military service varies from 45 to 65 depending on rank. And it talks about women, it talks about various categories of persons are exempt from carrying out military, and law also provides for certain categories of person to defer military service. So that's just a kind of general laws about people who won't be eligible for national service, but if you are not in one of those exempt categories, then you're fair game. Then this document usefully goes on to say whether military service would involve acts that are contrary to the basic rules of human conduct. And it says there's no evidence of generalized risks that military service would involve acts that are contrary to the basic rules of conduct. And the onus is on a person to show otherwise. So in other words, the way that the as I was mentioning, the way that the Ukrainian armed forces are conducting themselves would not qualify as a basis for refugee status, but I think you would much easier find that in the case of Russia, and that's broadly what it goes on to say there. The conditions of military service and whether the requirement to perform military service puts the person at risk of serious harm or mistreatment. So this is, as you can see, lots more here, and this is where we can go into huge amounts of depth if we really want. But this is actually the crux of it. So let me just read a few of these to you. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, conditions for military service will have changed, and owing to limitations in reporting, it's not 100% clear what current conditions of military service are. Treatment received during military service may, in limited circumstances, be sufficiently serious by its nature and or repetition as to engage Article 3 EHCR. Consideration must be given on a case-by-case basis. So it's saying that, broadly, you won't qualify as a refugee from what we know at the moment, but things may change. This is war. But here's the one. A fear of being killed due to a requirement to take part in military service is not a sufficient ground for a grant of asylum or humanitarian protection. This is because Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights may be derogated from in relation to lawful acts of war. That is essentially the key to what we are saying. So we're not talking about conscientious objection here. We are talking to the fear of being killed or injured due to a requirement to take part in military service. Not a sufficient ground of asylum or humanitarian protection. That is part of the European Convention on Human Rights. So, that is why I believe countries in Europe are able to argue either way on this. Well, certainly argue that they can send people back. I'm not sure that Berthold is particularly right that it's clear that you are entitled to refugee status. It goes on to give lots of other information talking about conscripts as opposed to mobilization. Conscripts not being sent to combat zones is something that the that the Russians have got in place, but they broke it very early on in the war when they invaded, and they actually had conscripts there. So if you're conscripted for your kind of national service, you're not supposed to be sent to the front line because you're not trained up enough, etc., etc. Punishment for draft evasion or desertion, including conscientious objecting. So that's, again, it's interesting wording there, because that's saying conscientious objection isn't all forms of draft evasion. This is punishment for draft evasion, including conscientious objection, but not entailing just conscientious objection. In other words, there are other types of draft evasion, and this goes back to the idea of sending conscientious objectors back to Ukraine and denying them the right of asylum is not a moral minefield. We're not just talking about conscientious objectors. So sorry to go over the same point again, but it's really important. Anyway, loads more in that, but I think that's really useful from the UK there. Now, it's interesting when you go and look at, so here's I think some legal organisation, military service evasion, talks about the UNHCR that we've gone through already. It talks about the European Union's approach to military service evasion. So the European Union, in contrast, explicitly addresses military service evasion in Directive 2011/95. Acts of persecution can, inter alia, take the form of prosecution or punishment for refusal to perform military service in a conflict where performing military service would include crimes or acts falling within the scope of the grounds of exclusion as set out in Article 12.2, including crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations as set out in the preamble and Articles 1 and 2 of the Charter of the United Nations. In other words, that, again, it would have to be, pretty terrible things that you were doing or that would result from you evading draft. Further decisions from the Court of Justice of the EU have fleshed out the directive above. In practice, however, European countries have taken divergent approaches to people fleeing military service. For example, so if it was that clear-cut, why are they taking divergent approaches? For example, a large percentage of Eritrean asylum seekers' claims are related to conscription. While the demographics of Eritrean asylum seekers do not seem to vary meaningfully between states, the state's treatment of their claims does. While the average refugee recognition rate of Eritreans in the EU has been over 50% since 2014, the Netherlands in that time has never granted refugee status to more than 1% of Eritrean asylum seekers, and Malta has only done so in 2017. See a visualization. So, in other words, that states around the EU have, in a similar kind of case to Ukraine in Eritrea, have treated Eritreans vastly differently, and the percentages range from almost no successful asylum claims or refugee claims to over 50%, which is interesting because I'm pretty sure he said that all of them automatically get refugee status. If a country doesn't adhere to the principles set out here, that's the EU, then they are in contravention of the convention and subject to international scrutiny and sanctions. Well, actually, there are disagreements. Subjective rights are indeed clear-cut. I beg to disagree. If a Ukrainian male refugee says that he is afraid of being shot, etc., by Russians, were he in Ukraine, he will automatically be recognised as a refugee. Not at all the case. And in fact, using Eritrea as an example shows you that that is not the case. And you can look at case law. 2 cases flashed out the EU's approach to asylum seekers evading military service. And we have one two, both from Germany. So one concerned a Syrian man referred to as EZ, fled Syria after receiving a conscription letter. He too claimed asylum in Germany, but was granted subsidiary protection instead. So he didn't get that refugee status, but got something else. And then that was appealed, and the case reached the CJEU. The court reasoned that because the Syrian army, including the units composed of conscripts, repeatedly and systematically committed war crimes, it should be assumed that the performance of his or her military service will involve committing directly or indirectly such crimes or acts regardless of his or her field of operation. So then I presume it got allowed on appeal or something there. But the point is that this is different to Ukraine because the Syrian army is systematically committing war crimes, and they are composed of conscripts. And his military service would have involved committing directly or indirectly such crimes or acts. And as we saw from the UK documentation, that is not the case for Ukrainians. So that would not entail that a Ukrainian would automatically qualify for for refugee status. So here we have another one. It concerns an enlisted American helicopter maintenance mechanic named Andre Shepard, who went absent without leave from the US Army base in Katterbach, Germany, and claimed asylum. Shepard stated that he feared prosecution and social ostracism on account of his refusal to continue to participate in a war he considered illegal. German authorities, so this is conscientious objection, by the way. German authorities rejected his refugee claim, so he appealed and his case was referred to the CJEU. The CJEU clarified that under Article 9, a person refusing to perform military service would need to, quote, invoke only the likelihood of acts falling under the grounds of exclusion being committed. It would not be necessary to show that the asylum seeker's particular unit had committed war crimes or crimes against humanity already, nor that the International Criminal Court have found the acts to be war crimes or crimes against humanity. Additionally, the asylum seeker would not need to show that they would have been serving directly in combat. This is especially relevant for people who fled conscription prior to having been assigned a particular role. Rather, Article 9(e)(2), quote, concerns the situation in which it is reasonably likely that by the performance of his task he would provide indispensable support to the preparation or execution of these crimes. But that is again referring to conscientious objection, not the risk of dying in military after military mobilization. And then there's lots more draft evaders and refugee protection. Here is a School of Advanced Study at the University of London. I'm just going to pick something out for you here. This piece is to do with Russian draft evaders, not Ukrainian. And it talks about a lot of case precedents and whatnot. But it says the conclusion here is, I believe that Russian draft evaders would be able to make good claims to protection if in the UK or any other country with a parallel interpretation of its obligations under international refugee law. Such claims may ultimately come in much greater numbers than heretofore, not just from Russia, but elsewhere, given the apparent defrosting of post-Soviet frozen conflicts, such as between Armenia and Azerbaijan, etc., etc., etc. For the moment, the reaction of states in the European area to Russian draft evaders seeking entry has been decidedly mixed. So some countries actually refused Russians on this basis. I think some of the Baltic nations, because of their history and whatnot. But all states will have to consider how to address those claims, not only by considering applications when individuals are able to enter the territory to make them, but also by considering whether the range of non-entree measures they have routinely deployed against potential asylum seekers and their frequent resistance to burden sharing among states have to be reconsidered. The longer-term moral and political, as well as legal credibility of combining opposition to Russian conduct in its conflict with Ukraine with effective victimization of human beings trying to avoid contributing to Russia's efforts is minimal. As a leader in The Economist recently urged, European states bent on exclusion of potential asylum seekers presently risk undermining the credibility as defenders of human rights and alienating those from Russia most strongly aligned with the West. Quote, if Europe shuts its borders to all Russians, it is handing Mr. Putin tangible evidence that he is right. And I would I think I agree with this. But this is a differentiation between Russian and Ukrainian draft evaders, because you can build a really strong case, as it talks about here, that, by both fighting for the Russian armed forces, you're doing terrible things, and that you can make a really strong case for conscientious objection. And also the threat of persecution is, death. You can be persecuted as far as being killed, both on the front lines and potentially, by poor treatment in prison, but certainly you get a long time in prison, etc., in Russia. So the case there is, I think, a lot stronger. And again, there's more on Russians as well. Here's another article in Just Security, the legal obligation to recognize Russian deserters as refugees. And again, I would broadly agree with this too. So it is, I think, we've got three things going on. You've got two things going on. You've got conscientious objectors and those wanting to avoid risk. And within conscientious objectors, you will have, say, Russians and Ukrainians. So there will be some Ukrainian conscientious objectors that would no doubt qualify for refugee status, but they would have to establish the genuineness of their claims and get over a sufficiency criterion. So it has to be sufficiently reasonable and credible and genuine that they have political, moral, or religious objections to being mobilized in Ukraine. They can't get away with the persecution argument, it seems. The Russians, however, can get away with conscientious objection, I think, more easily than Ukrainians. And that will involve certainly the persecution aspect. And that's one big differentiator, I think, between the Russians and Ukrainians. But if you're moving out of the just conscientious objector category and are moving just to the risk category, sorry, too much talking, then I think you are on much shakier ground and it is much more difficult. And this has been set out very clearly in some of these documents that I have shared with you, that you do not automatically qualify for refugee status based on objecting to war because you don't want to be mobilized because of the risk. Hopefully that clears it up. It's still going to be a moral minefield. The moral minefield is making those subjective arguments or those case-by-case arguments if you're a conscientious objector. But if you're not a conscientious objector, I don't think you have a case to make to being of refugee status in the EU or in anywhere that is under the jurisdiction of the UNHCR. And then the question is, what do European countries, for example, do about that when Ukraine asks them for their mobilized age men back predominantly? Do they send them back? Do they keep them? But it won't be an argument over refugee status. It will be more to do with, I guess, other kind of politicking. And of course, that's not to say that you won't then get a lot of people trying to claim refugee status. So they might then try and say, oh, I'm actually really afraid of being mobilized, so I'm going to do some post hoc rationalization, which is rationalizing after the fact. So I intuitively don't want to do this, and I'm now going to add my rationalization on, which is going to look like conscientious objection. But it's actually probably not what I genuinely believe. It's not really what's driving my desire not to be mobilized. It's the fear. And I'm not attacking people for this, by the way. I absolutely get that going to war is frightening. It's easy for me to sit here and make moral judgments about people. I'm not doing that. Hopefully, I've not given you any indication as to whether I think it's right or wrong that a person evades draft and goes to Europe to try and get out of being called up to the army, even if they fully agree with what the army is doing. Some people are brave, other people are less brave. Some people feel they've got too much to lose, and other people not so much. Other people evaluate things very differently. Far be it from me to make moral judgments on those people. But the question here is whether they are justified under international refugee legislation to claim refugee status or not. Hopefully this has at least somewhat cleared some of this up. Sorry, it's a lot of me banging on, and it is just stream of consciousness. So where I do go blah 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 blah, and lose my way, it's because it is what it is. And very last thing, thank you to Berthold. This is all in the context of good faith dialogue and discussion. And while we may disagree on this particular topic, I really appreciate him taking the time to answer those. And I don't always. So notifications for replies to my comments, I very rarely get to see. So if I say something, someone replies to that, it's more difficult for me to find those. But I came across those just today, and literally I'd only pulled up all these resources like 5 minutes before I started speaking. So very little preparation. If I've got anything wrong, or if Berthold can find a problem with my arguments here, what I've said, please, Berthold or anyone, do so, because it's all about us trying to get to a better understanding of how the world works, of how the military jurisprudence works, and how we understand draft evaders in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Anyway, thanks guys. Take care. Speak soon.